Hello everyone, Kristy Rice here with a new video for you. I can't wait to dive in, but first I wanted to actually show you my face, but not in real time because I didn't do my hair today. So that's fancy me. Hey, there I am. And soon you're gonna see just real me and my little guy Izzy. And I just wanted to put a face to my name so you know I'm actually real. And I promise someday soon I will actually hop on screen and say hello. But anyway, let's get started. So I am painting leaves today, guys. It's really simple. You know my mantra, art for joy's sake. You know I like to keep things simple and I like to just kind of run with it. So today I'm using the Royal & Langnickel 1/4 inch mini majestic dagger brush. And I'm going to link to all materials, as I always do, in the description. And I am just starting out with the broad side of my brush. And really, you're going to see me go through a bunch of different techniques and different approaches to leaves. I'm not going to put a name to these leaves because I wouldn't be able to. I'm not a botanist. Anyway, but I'm just creating a variety of shapes, a variety of intensities, a variety of texture, and a variety of detail, all with one brush. Because again, I don't want you to get tangled up in the minutia of how to paint correctly, 16 different brushes, always pulling them out and using them for different things. That's not what I'm all about. What I am about is encouraging and inspiring an artistic journey that keeps you coming back to the painting table, so to speak. We call it a painting table in our studio here. I want to keep you coming back to painting. So I don't want to make it cumbersome. I don't want to make it require a ton of materials and a ton of an investment. I want to make it fun. So here we are. Put together a couple leaves here. And basically the trick is, or whatever you want to call it, the trick, the technique, the secret, is just using your one brush, this brush in particular, to its fullest potential. And what that means is varying the pressure on your brush. So you'll notice using the tip there specifically, and this is real time right now, guys. I did not speed this up or slow it down. Just using the tip, very light pressure. Again, using the tip from a different angle. So you're going to be using the brush at a different angle, depending on the shape you want. You're going to be using it different pressure, depending on the thickness of line that you want. So if you want a thinner line, you're barely going to whisper a touch onto the paper. If you want a thicker line, you're going to press down like I did just there. This is a little secret here, leaving a little white space in between the two strokes that you're making to create that leaf gives just a really beautiful kind of convincing feel of a vein in the leaf. So I'm a big fan of leaving a little bit. I don't do it all the time, but it makes things feel light and airy and not too heavy and not too just involved. It just gives you a really convincing, easy breezy watercolor leaf. So decent pressure there. That leaf is a curved leaf, and I made it by creating two brush strokes, very similar pressure, very similar angle, right next to one another. Feel free to back that up or pause it. Two brush strokes using the broad side of the tip of the brush right next to one another. And what I did is I mixed up a little bit of an amber color, and again, guys, if you know me, I'm not going to sit here and tell you the exact pigment names. I'm not going to tell you the exact brands all the time, although this time around I am using Core watercolors because I don't want you to get tangled up in that either. So just mix up a peachy, kind of a muddy peachy tone. And I let that go into the green I had just laid down there to create a wet and wet kind of mingling experience. This is Silver Dollar Eucalyptus, which is kind of a broad, roundish leaf. I started with a dusty blue. Just mix up a little blue and a little orange, or a little blue and a little black, depending on the look you're after, and you'll get that dusty blue. And just create a circle with a little bit of a point on it. Honestly, that's all I did. I chose a second color while the first color was still wet, kind of a light limey green, and added it in there. Creating a second Silver Dollar petal, went in with that light dusty blue, went back into the palette afterwards, and I'm adding some definition. And just notice that's clean water there I'm putting on to kind of blend everything together. That is a trick I love. When you have two colors on the page, you want to blend them a bit better. Clean water on the brush and just dab the clean water over the two colors, and they will start to really blend beautifully. So just as I was saying, really watch how I'm using the brush here. Tip. A little bit more pressure. Trademark Kristy move and some really expected color, and I'm just dotting that into the wet areas so they will kind of almost disperse on their own. I'm just using the tip there again, just against the edge. This is called something I call contrast detailing. There is an entire YouTube video of mine dedicated to contrast detailing. I will link to it for you. And that is essentially where you just start touching the edge of a wet area, and just the edge of it, and it disperses the color in kind of a controlled way. So I'm a little bit further on here. I'm just adding more leaves. I'm staying with a very kind of dusty, soft, not vibrant at all palette. You can do this however you'd like, but I do encourage you to experiment with these dusty colors. They're so beautiful and luminescent. Again, this is kind of a dusty blue. Mixing any blue with the opposite on the color wheel, so that would be orange, you're going to kind of get a dusty blue. I do love bringing in blacks here and there. I don't overuse black. They tend to make things look a little dull if you're overusing them. Going back in here with my tip, let's see, and then a little bit of the broadside tip, broadside lift up. See all that pressure going on there? Tip, broadside, lift up. So a great thing to do, I mean, this easily is practice. This is not necessarily something I will go and scan and use in my work. This is amazing practice, but if you did want to do a finished piece like this, I highly recommend just doing a page of practice first. There's another video on my channel of line work and just practicing and exercising your hand with line work and really paying attention to really getting your hand accustomed to different pressures. See that? A lot of pressure there, a lot of pressure, a little bit less pressure. Two strokes right next to one another. Anyway, I digress. Getting your hand used to the different pressures, the different angles, the different sides of a brush, especially a brush like this. Not all brushes are this versatile. Just a pointed round brush or an angled brush, classic angled brush. Those aren't as versatile, in my opinion, as these daggers. Daggers are so versatile, and they've got so much potential for just one painting. And a dagger brush has so much scope for you. I'm only using the dagger brush here today because I want to prove to you, as I've done before on this channel, that if you have one really good, really versatile brush, you're going to be using it all the time. So going back to practice, going back to the idea of getting your hand used to these strokes, these different angles, the different parts of your dagger brush is really, it's fun, but it's also extremely good for your technique. So, and it's going to give you confidence. I am not all about practicing and practicing and practicing and calling this painting practice, and I'm only gonna start on my real painting once I feel like I've really mastered the practice. I am really about diving in a lot of ways, but there are certain practice techniques, practice experiences that I believe give you so much confidence that they're well worth doing, and they're well worth fitting in and using up your painting time for. So here I'm just adding in some really small details of eucalyptus texture. I'm barely putting any pressure on that brush. Again, just really pay attention. I invite you to kind of pause and back up the video so you can really see what part of the brush I'm using. I'm doing a little bit of a maidenhair, I don't remember the name of it. I think it's maidenhair fern. A little bit of that here, a suggestion of that. I'm using the broad side of the tip of this brush and just making tiny little kind of staccato strokes, so very tiny and quick. And then I'm going to go back in and add in some branches, very, very fine branches, and you'll see, there we go. Barely touching the brush. This takes practice. You see how I just made some thicker strokes that I really didn't want to make. Those first few strokes were nice and thin and wispy, but then when I changed the angle of my brush, instead of changing the angle of my paper, things get a little trickier. That's another thing. I mentioned this on Instagram recently. Speaking of paper, I notice a lot on Instagram videos, painters are using kind of a cheating technique. I call it cheating. Sorry guys, where you actually rotate your paper to suit your angle, the angle that you want to paint at. I was taught by a purist, and I've mentioned her before, and she would not let us turn our paper. I'm just going to interrupt my thought here for these really wispy lines. I did slow down the video here, guys, so just really take a look. I'm just using the tip. I'm just letting that color drag out, reloading in, about every 5 strokes or so. And I'm kind of creating the curve by following what's already there. So let's watch this again. Definitely feel free to blot on a paper towel. See how I'm just creating that nice little curve. And you can see me pausing. I'm pausing in between each stroke because I'm thinking about, where do I want this to go? Where do I want it to? What direction do I want these strokes to go in? So I am thinking. I'm not just like crazy painting lady who doesn't, think about anything or have any strategy, but I try not to overthink. I'm going to start over here again. There we go. Nice light strokes. And notice again, I'm not changing the angle of my paper. And back to that point, I see a lot of folks on Instagram, professional, seasoned artists who are changing the angle of their paper. And this is something that I really try to commit to. Just it's a personal thing. It's not better. It's not right. It's not wrong. But to discipline myself and train my hand, I've always tried to keep my paper in the same direction the entire length of the painting time. So it's easier, absolutely. When you want to paint the other side of a leaf, your natural instinct is to just re-angle the paper. But to train your hand to really practice a bit of coordination, to build up that muscle memory in your hand, leave it at the angle it's at and change your hand and change your brush. So just a little personal preference that I encourage you to try because it will take you leaps and bounds in your confidence in a very short amount of time. I'm going in here now and adding some really intense indigo. If you don't have a tube of paint that says indigo, it's okay. Just mix together like a cobalt blue, ultramarine, any kind of blue, brighter blue, and black will give you a decent indigo. Really light strokes here I'm going to put in as veins, really light. Again, this is where practice really comes in handy because I'm familiar with this brush. I know what it's going to do most times. I know what kind of pressure I need to put on it to get the look I'm after. But that's only because I have done this line work technique so many times. So I'm just starting from the center of that vein and just pulling out. When I pull the brush away from the center, I lift up. There we go. Pull, lift up, 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 pull, lift up. Again, I just really encourage you to back this film up and take a look at things over and over and over again and really study it, because you will start to notice a trend in how I'm making these strokes, and a trend in how I'm holding the brush, and a trend in what part of the brush I'm using. Oh, breaking my own rules? No, not quite. Okay, so now at this point in your painting, you might start to think about, well, goodness, you know, is this going to turn into a real painting, or is this just going to be practice? Try to avoid those thoughts, because that's when things start to go south. I know for myself, when I start to worry too much about, is this going to look good? Is this looking good? Is this something I'm going to want to keep? Is this something I'm going to want to post on Instagram? And you start to lose your flow, and you start to get inside your head. Your emotions start to take over, and it just derails you. So try to just focus on the act itself, the strokes, the colors, and keep your thoughts of the finished piece out of your mind. Another signature trick of mine, just really unexpected color. I am using a bright pink, and then I'm going back and forth with my brush, clean water, and I'm kind of pulling out some of those colors that I just laid down. Going back into this particular leaf with more indigo while it's still wet. And over here, I didn't like all the bleeding that was happening into that lighter green leaf, so I'm going to define that a bit more. Not that the two bleeding together is a bad thing necessarily, but just today, for some reason, I wasn't feeling it. So I wanted a really nice sharp edge at that particular point in the composition. I think a lot about the clusters of leaves that I'm putting together. I like a sense of movement in my painting, so you'll notice later on when I show you an overview of this whole piece that we've been working on, the clusters of leaves tend to kind of have a direction. So all these dark leaves are kind of generally pointing downwards, and the eucalyptus in the upper right corner that I started with are kind of, there you go, you know, they're also kind of, you know, pointing downwards, but not in such a strong kind of obvious way. So I like to think about, like, is this a bouquet of leaves that I'm painting? Is everything, you know, kind of hanging downwards? I like to think about things like that, because I feel like when you pay attention to the direction of the leaves, or let's say we were painting flowers, within the whole composition, you really make a stronger composition. Isn't that beautiful? Look at that. I mixed up like a really pretty like salmon color with like a bright pink, a little bit of orange, and like a little bit of burnt umber, and put it right next to that indigo leaf that was still wet. And I knew it was going to happen, but it's just so beautiful how that really just exploded there, and I'm going to leave that go. So anyway, back to the compositional talk. I just like to think about these clusters of leaves, and if you're painting flowers, you're painting flowers, and how they're hanging, where the weight of the piece is, where you know, the bigger leaves, how do they cluster, and how do they spray, and how do they move on the page. So I'm not just randomly putting down leaves necessarily. I am thinking about the kind of flow of the whole piece. And obviously in this particular piece, the leaves are all kind of pointing downwards. So I'm kind of keeping that theme going. I love this touch. I love contrast between really dark areas like those leaves at the bottom and the indigo, and really sheer and fluid areas like these salmon pink sheer leaves that I'm adding in. And so I love to see contrast like that in my paintings, and I think that is something that really it speaks to, if you had to put my style, quote unquote, into words, that would be it. A contrast of detail, a contrast of textures, and a contrast of finishes. And so what things could you do in your painting that would bring out or make your style more obvious? adding in on top of these salmon kind of pink leaves a little bit of unexpected bright brassy yellow. It just gives them kind of a luminescent quality. That's just another element of my particular technique that I love. I love bringing in really unexpected color and letting it soften and just letting the subtleties of that unexpected color shine through in a particular area of the painting. More line work here. Again, just thinking about the angle of your brush, very much using the tip with that line work. And I'm actually holding the brush fairly close to the barrel, and the barrel of the brush is that metal part that holds the bristles in. And so make sure you're not holding your brush too far up. The closer you hold your brush to the barrel, the more control you'll have. Here's a little bit more of contrast detailing. And what I do to create this technique is I add a darker tone of color at the edge of something. So I want to define where those two leaves of the eucalyptus are overlapping one another. So I'm putting a dark bit of color, cleaning my brush, getting clean water on the brush, and going right next to that dark color I just added and softening it and fading it out. And see, now I've created a shadow. Let's try that again. Dark color, clean your brush, load up with actual clean water, and blend the two together. There we go. This one's a little bit more intense, so it'll take a little bit more blending, but just some clean water. Make sure your brush is really rinsed out. Clean water on top of that will really make the difference. There we go. And just blend, blend, blend. Contrast detailing is great when you're at the end of a painting and you're just not sure, you need something to really give it some oomph. You don't want it to be super juicy watercolor, loosey-goosey style. You want to give it a little more definition. Contrast detailing is the way to go. And again, I will link to that video where I explored that technique in more detail. Really soft on the page, barely touching. Areas here are still wet. That is something that I think for especially beginner artists, it can be really frustrating because you have to try to remember what areas of your painting are still wet. And sometimes you will make a mistake. You will put some more color on a leaf or a petal thinking that it was dry, and then you realize very quickly that it wasn't. And definitely don't let panic set in at that point, because here's the good news. If you lay color down on an area that you thought was dry but it's wet, and you're now getting a finished look that you're not after, good news is that it's still wet. So you just take some clean water on your brush, scoop up that area where you just laid the unwanted color down, and blot it on a paper towel, and repeat that until you've removed the color. So I always say, if watercolor is still wet on the page, you're in good shape, because that means it hasn't dried, it hasn't become permanent, so to speak, yet. And there's still, as you know, even things you can do once watercolor has dried to kind of soften it. But you don't panic. Don't panic if that happens. Adding some more dark leaves up here in the upper right corner. I was just feeling like the painting was becoming a little heavy, a little somber, with everything pointing downwards and with all the darkness at the bottom. So I'm going to create a little movement up here. Watch what I'm doing to create these curved leaves. Start with one. Your overlap areas in a composition like this are so important, where one leaf overlaps another, and how you place the next stroke or how you place the next leaf. For it to be convincing, you really have to be looking at the whole picture as you paint this one or two or three leaves. Just soak that in for a minute. Back up the video. Hear me say that again. And really soak in what that means, to be really looking at the whole area while you're just painting one or two leaves. Times that come up where that is helpful in being able to see the big picture and the single leaf at the same time are times like these where you want to create a curved, graceful area, cluster of leaves. But you've got so much else already on the page that if you don't pay attention to everything else as well, you might not get that flowy look that you're after. So I encourage you, yes, to back that up. Listen to me say that a couple of times while you watch me create that cluster that I just put down. I think that is a really strong point to be made and lesson to be learned, being able to kind of watch the big picture while you're painting the small. So happy to take questions on that, guys. I always am open to your questions, and definitely reach out to me, Kristy the Painter on Instagram. I'm often answering questions in stories, and I want to hear from you. If there are things that you'd like me to demo in the future when I'm considering the filming schedule for this channel, then by all means let me know. I want to hear from you. Wrapping up here with this maidenhair fern, adding little touches of red just for detailing, because I just felt like it. I know they're not really red, but I don't care because I think it looks cool. And definitely getting my flow back with these thin wispy lines for these wispy branches that we tried earlier and got a little crazy. So just taking a look, thinking about last touches I want to add, a little bit more detailing in the stem here. But really, all in all, guys, just keep in mind when you're using this kind of brush, any kind of dagger, any kind of, even the new triangle brushes, not new, but they seem to be gaining a lot of popularity lately. So they all are going to require that you think, see, I thought that was dry, and that was so not dry. So clean water, scrubbing it out, lifting it out, spreading it around, and blotting onto, there we go, scooping it up. There we go. Totally thought that was dry. Anyway, any kind of brush that has multiple edges, dagger, triangle, you really want to think about your pressure, and you want to think about the angle at which you're holding the brush. These brushes, literally, I could take this one brush on a 2-week international trip where I was going to be painting my butt off. I could take this one brush and be completely satisfied and fulfilled with that choice of brush to take. That's how strongly I feel about these types of brushes. They are a workhorse, but you just have to know how to work them. Back to the painting, a little more contrast detailing here, really strong, coming in with clean water right next to that dark area I just laid down. Clean water, scrub back, pull, lift, 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 and blot. Beautiful. Love that. Love that. Well, guys, I cannot thank you enough for listening to me ramble yet again. I really enjoyed this demo, and I really would love to see you give it a whirl. Post your images in stories or on Instagram or on Facebook, and use the hashtag #ArtForJoySake so I can see what you're up to. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you again soon.